son only lived for a month. I'm not going to dredge up every detail. It's too painful. But the sound of my wife's tears will haunt me forever. Grief is ugly. It's raw, relentless, and unforgiving. When we lost him, it was like my wife's soul was tearing itself apart. Her cries were sharp enough to cut glass, deep enough to freeze your blood. Those cries turned into screams. Screams at the universe, at some cruel higher power, at herself, at me. She screamed until her voice shredded, like her throat couldn't handle the weight of her pain anymore. I'll admit, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't care. It's just that her grief filled every corner of our world, leaving no room for mine. It felt like she was crying for both of us. And no pain is louder, no sadness more shared than the cries of a grieving mother. I wish there were a guidebook for this, a step-by-step on how to navigate grief. Something that could prepare you for both the before and the after. The before is just waiting, watching time run out grain by grain in the hourglass of life. I remember my heart pounding when the monitor flatlined. That wave of realization hit me. This is it. I'm going to have to grieve now. Before I even felt the pain, I knew it was coming for me like a train I couldn't stop. I told myself I'd need to fight for life once this was over. Maybe I'd started grieving him before he was even gone. Maybe I thought I was ready. But, truthfully, no one ever is. Then there's the after. Not when you leave the hospital or drive home, but the moment you walk through the front door. That's when it truly begins. The air feels heavy. The house is too quiet. And there's this hollow, aching void in your chest, your relationship, your home. This is what life is now. It's real. The worst part? That new life felt oddly familiar, like stepping back into the one I had before he arrived. I felt guilty, not for missing him, but for mourning the future he'll never have. I grieved the milestones, his first birthday, his first steps, his graduations. I would have given anything, even those angsty teenage fights, just to have him here. My wife's grief was different. She missed the little things. Holding him close, humming to him. Even the 3 a.m. wake-ups when he cried. We didn't talk much about it, but we didn't need to. We were on separate paths, dealing with it in our own ways. At night, we'd sleep with our backs to each other. If I reached out, she'd flinch like my touch burned her. It hurt, but I got it. She needed space. The funeral was hell. No, worse than hell. At least hell is warm. That day was cold, bitter, and suffocating. I stood alone at the casket, staring down at him, and all I could think was, caskets shouldn't be this small. It was so tiny I could have held it in my arms. When they lowered him into the ground, my wife's cries pierced the still morning air. They were so raw, it felt like the pain was ripping through her all over again. She didn't fall into my arms. She crumpled to the ground, like she wanted to go with him. When we came home, the void was even deeper. We packed up the nursery together, boxing up every little piece of his short life. Then we argued. She wanted to put the boxes in the attic, but I said I'd never be able to go up there again if we did. In the end, we left the room as it was, shut the door, and let the dust settle. We didn't lock it, though, just closed it. I think that door became a symbol of our grief, something we weren't ready to seal away for good. Every day doesn't get easier. It just gets further away from the day we lost him. Mornings are the hardest. You wake up, open your eyes, feel the sun on your face, and then it hits you. You're grieving, and you'll carry it with you for the rest of your life. Little things started to drive us apart. Forgetting to do the dishes could spiral into one of us sleeping on the couch or heading out for a long drive at midnight. We tried couples therapy, but it didn't even scratch the surface. We didn't just need therapy for us. We needed it for what we'd lost. The wedge between us wasn't us. It was him. I was at my breaking point, unsure of how to keep going. When I came home one evening and heard a soft humming from our bedroom, it froze me in my tracks. That tune, it was the same one my wife had hummed at the hospital, right before the heart monitor went silent. Frowning, I climbed the stairs. The door was cracked open just enough for me to peek inside. What I saw didn't feel real. My wife was lying in bed, cradling a baby in her arms, gazing at it like she could see the whole universe in its tiny face. I stood there, blinking, wondering if I'd somehow stepped into a dream. I pinched my thigh, the sharp sting reminding me I was awake. She was so absorbed in it that I could have stood there forever without her noticing. Finally, I managed to stammer, "H, honey?" Her head snapped up and she smiled. An expression I hadn't seen in what felt like ages. "Oh, hi," she said, almost casually. I pointed toward her arms. What are you holding?" Her eyes flicked to the bundle, and her smile faltered for a split second. "Oh, this? It's a reborn doll." "A what?" "They're these super realistic dolls made for mothers. It's supposed to help me cope." She nodded quickly, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. I just stood there, staring. Oh, I couldn't take my eyes off it, or her. The way she looked at it wasn't like it was plastic. She held it as if it were our son. "Is it helping?" I asked cautiously. "I've only had it for a few hours," she admitted, "but it's comforting." It made my skin crawl a little, to be honest. But if nothing else had worked, I was willing to accept anything that might bring her some peace. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked suddenly, tilting her head. I froze. Part of me wanted to refuse, to back away. How could I hold it and give her the reaction she was looking for? I couldn't see it as anything but a doll, but I knew this wasn't about me. So, reluctantly, I walked over and held out my arms. As soon as she placed it in my hands, a chill shot through me. Its cold, lifeless skin sent shivers down my spine. I cradled it close, staring down at its face, and before I knew it, I fell apart. Tears poured out of me, and I collapsed to my knees, clutching it tightly. It wasn't real. I knew that, but holding it brought back everything I missed. Not just the life we'd lost, but the moments we never got to have. I cried harder than I ever had, my voice cracking with each sob. My wife waited silently, watching as I broke down. When I finally stopped, I felt lighter, like I'd let go of something I'd been holding onto for far too long. After that, things started to improve, little by little. It didn't fill the void, but it felt like something was standing in that empty space, holding us together for the time being. On her hardest days, when even getting out of bed seemed impossible, she'd cradle the doll, hum to it, sometimes even pretend to breastfeed it. I won't lie, it still unsettled me. There was comfort in it, but it wasn't him. And I think that's when the wedge between us deepened. One evening, I came home and felt my stomach drop as I climbed the stairs. Light spilled out of that door. We never locked it, but we both left it shut, untouched. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I approached the nursery. When I pushed the door open, I froze. The room looked like it had the day we brought him home. Everything was back in its place, perfectly arranged. The boxes that had once held his things were gone. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, taking it all in. Then my eyes landed on the crib. Slowly, I moved closer, gripping the railing tightly as I leaned in. Lying there, nestled under the blankets, was the doll. "I didn't hear you come in," she said, startling me as I turned around so fast I almost lost my balance. "Jesus, you scared me. What is this?" I asked, motioning toward the room. "What do you mean?" "This," I said, gesturing more pointedly. "What's all this?" "It's our nursery." "Well, yeah, I can see that. But why is everything unpacked?" She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Our baby needs a nursery." We stared at each other, both accusing the other of being insane without saying the words. Look, I've read about these dolls. I get how they're supposed to help. I'll admit, it's helped me too in a way. But this? I gestured around the room again. This isn't what?" she snapped, cutting me off. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I was stuck. "I'm just concerned," I finally muttered. She crossed her arms and tilted her head. "I unpacked all of this myself. I'll put it back when I'm ready." "Okay." Her tone was sharp, her eyes cold. I felt 1,000 words rising in my throat, but all I could manage was, "Okay. I think I need some alone time with him," she said, brushing past me into the room. I nodded, swallowing my frustration, and slipped out of the nursery. I was trying, really trying, to be patient, but I just couldn't go as far as she was. Pretending this was our baby might help her, but for me, it only made everything worse. That night, we didn't exchange a single word as we lay in bed. She faced the baby monitor she'd reloaded with fresh batteries, while I stared out the window, making shapes out of the moonlight. Eventually, I fell asleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from my dreams. The room was quiet, bathed in soft moonlight, until I heard it, the faint sound of crying coming from the baby monitor. I sat up and rubbed my eyes, staring at the static-filled monitor as the cries continued. "Liv? Wake up," I said, shaking her shoulder. She groaned and lifted her sleep mask, squinting at the monitor. I glanced from her to the glowing screen, my heart pounding. With a sigh, she tossed the mask onto the dresser and got out of bed. "I'll handle him. Get some sleep." I watched, frozen, as she shuffled toward the nursery. Her voice crackled through the monitor as she entered the room. "Sure, it's okay," she cooed softly, her voice as steady as I'd ever heard it. I sat there, stiff as a board, listening as she hummed that same lullaby. The crying faded into silence. My eyes stayed glued to the monitor until she came back into the room, grabbed her mask, and slid back into bed without a word. Part of me wanted to follow her, to go into the nursery and see for myself. But I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling until my eyes were dry and bloodshot. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted, but I dragged myself out of bed to get ready for work. As I passed the nursery, I paused. For a moment, I thought about going in. Instead, I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing, just silence. I didn't know what I was hoping to hear, or dreading to hear. Either way, I wasn't sure if hearing something would make me feel more or less crazy. That day at work was brutal. I kept nodding off at my desk, struggling to focus. Conversations felt like white noise. By the time I got home, all I wanted to do was collapse. When I walked into the kitchen, my wife was at the sink, washing dishes. She turned her head and smiled faintly. "Hey, hun." "Hi," I muttered, kicking off my shoes. "How was work?" The usual." "Be quiet when you go upstairs," she said with a chuckle. "I just put him down, and it wasn't easy." "I'll make sure not to wake at him," I said, catching myself. She gave me a quick glare before turning back to the sink. I cleared my throat awkwardly and headed upstairs, trying to keep the steps from creaking. As I passed the nursery door, I felt the air leave my lungs. That door always did something to me. Dinner was painfully quiet. The clinking of silverware and the occasional sip of water were the only sounds breaking the silence. "I was thinking of taking him to a mommy and me class," she said suddenly, looking up from her plate. I stopped chewing, unsure if I'd heard her right. Yeah, sounds good," I said, forcing a smile. "I also wish you'd spend more time with him," she added, her voice quieter. "You avoid the nursery like it's haunted." I let out a weak laugh. I'll make sure to do that." "Thank you," she said softly, though the weight in her voice told me she didn't believe me. Watching her eat, I could see how much she was struggling to get the food down. She was trying, really trying, but it was like every bite weighed a ton. I felt guilty for not being more understanding. The truth was, we were grieving in completely different ways, and it was clear our grief wasn't helping each other. But I couldn't stop thinking about last night. The crying. How could it be crying? What really stuck with me was that it didn't seem to surprise her at all. I kept trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe she'd set up an alarm with a crying sound? Or maybe there was some kind of speaker built into the doll to make it seem more real. That made sense. Except, it sounded exactly like him. If you're not a parent, all baby cries probably sound the same. But not to me. I'd know those cries anywhere. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me, grief messing with my head. I didn't know what to believe. Later that night, after brushing my teeth, I was heading to bed when I noticed her in the nursery. She was in the rocking chair, slowly rocking back and forth, softly humming. "Hey," she said, noticing me lingering in the doorway. "I finally got him to sleep." "That's good," I mumbled. "Come say goodnight," she said with a gentle smile. I hesitated, but forced myself to step into the room. She stood up, walked over to the crib, and carefully laid the doll down. She bent over, kissed its forehead, and then looked at me expectantly. I glanced at her, then at the crib. I could tell she wanted me to do the same. My stomach churned, but I leaned forward anyway, puckering my lips as I moved closer. Then it hit me. A smell so awful it made my stomach turn. The closer I got, the worse it was. It reeked like something had died in there. I tried to push through, but I gagged, pulling back and covering my mouth. "What is wrong with you?" she snapped, her voice sharp and cutting. "I am sorry him. Not him," she yelled, her face red with anger. "Okay, fine. He smells like a garbage fire. What? Does he have some kind of built-in diaper function or something?" Her eyes filled with tears, and guilt immediately washed over me. My hands were shaking. "Just admit it," she said, her voice trembling. "You think this is all a joke? You think I'm losing it, don't you? Just say it." "Liv, no, I don't." "Actually, don't," she interrupted, shaking her head. "Just sleep somewhere else tonight. The couch, the porch, the sidewalk. I don't care." "Okay," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. I left the room before I could completely lose it. I felt like a monster, a horrible excuse for a husband. Trying to juggle both of our pain was breaking me apart, and it was breaking us apart. I collapsed onto the couch, yelling into a pillow until my voice gave out and my tears soaked through the fabric. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I passed out. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. My heart raced as I shot up, my eyes darting around the dark room. I threw off the blanket and stood up, trying to figure out what had happened. The room was pitch black, so I felt my way along the walls, searching for the light switch. That's when I stepped on something sharp. "Ow! Ugh!" I hissed, hopping on one foot as pain shot through me. I stumbled around in the dark, trying not to step on more glass. After what felt like forever, I finally found the switch and turned on the kitchen light. Looking down, I saw blood dripping from my foot, leaving a trail of red dots on the floor. I lifted it up to inspect the damage. A small shard of porcelain was embedded in my skin. Taking a deep breath, I bit my cheek and yanked it out. I let out a muffled groan, then placed the blood-streaked shard on the counter. That's when I noticed white powder on the bottom of my foot. Limping around the kitchen, I saw the mess. A shattered cookie jar and an open bag of flour spilled all over the floor. "Just great," I muttered under my breath, my head throbbing as I stared at the mess. I quickly wrapped an unused dish rag around my foot and started cleaning up the glass. The pain from the cut and the mess were enough to keep me from thinking too much about how the jar even fell in the first place. But I couldn't ignore it when I noticed small flour-covered footprints leading out of the kitchen. I finished throwing the last piece of glass away and stared down at the footprints, my brows furrowed. I limped over, crouched down, and took a closer look. They looked like... No, that's impossible. I told myself it couldn't be. But who else could have feet that small? It wasn't Sarah, and it wasn't an animal. I felt uneasy as I grabbed the vacuum and quickly cleaned it up. The trail went on longer than I expected as I left the kitchen and walked through the living room. I followed it to the stairs and noticed the footprints went up as well. I slowly looked up, then stared down the dark hallway. I had tried to explain away the crying last night, but this was different. This I couldn't explain. I took a deep breath and made my way up the stairs. Each footprint I vacuumed away felt like one more beat of my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the top, I realized the trail kept going. I followed it around a corner, where it ended at a door. That door. I stood there, my breaths heavy and shaky. I couldn't bring myself to open it. I just wanted to break down. It felt like I was being haunted by my own grief. How long I stood there, I don't know. It could have been a minute or an hour. It felt like forever before I finally turned away and went to the bathroom. I fought back tears as I checked my foot, making sure there was no glass left in it, then properly bandaged it. With everything that had happened, all I could think about was, why us? Why me? I just wanted to be a husband, a father, a family. Why did life have to be so unfair? It's not just about not getting what you want. It's about losing what you love. It's about losing a son after just a month. It's not unfair. It's just cruel. So cruel. After I finished bandaging my foot, I limped out of the bathroom, my body worn out. When I reached the nursery door, I froze. I could hear crying from behind it. I've never been much of a praying person, not even for my son, because it always felt like shouting into an empty space. But in that moment, I prayed. I prayed for it to stop. I needed it to stop, but no one was listening. Life's never been fair, and I should have known that by now. I opened my eyes, wiped away the tears that had started to form, and kept walking past the door. The crying got softer as I moved away, the ceiling between us blocking most of the sound. But I could still hear it. I could feel it calling out for me as I laid my head down on the couch. I hoped Sarah would wake up and take care of it, but she didn't. The whole night, I laid there, my tears drying on my face as the crying didn't stop. My mind was slowly falling apart. The sound kept echoing in my head, and it was getting harder and harder to figure out what was going on. I didn't want to care anymore. I just wanted to shut everything off, even for a few seconds. By the time morning came, the crying had stopped, but I couldn't tell when. "Nathan," Sarah said, her hand resting on my shoulder. I jumped and turned to her, startled. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." "It's okay. I just didn't sleep." I could see the guilt on her face. "Is everything okay?" "I want to apologize for last night. You've been so patient with me, and I feel like I've been asking too much." We sat in silence for a moment, neither of us knowing exactly what to say. "I appreciate it. I'm sorry too. I've been too harsh. We don't need to be on the same page to care about each other." She sat down next to me and rested her head on my shoulder. I kissed the top of her head and we sat there, just enjoying the quiet for a while. I wanted to ask about what I saw last night, but I figured now wasn't the time. "And about the smell, you weren't wrong. I went to check on him this morning, and it hit me hard," she said with a weak laugh. "Turns out, he was molding on the inside. It happens, apparently. I reached out to the seller, and she said it's due to bad upkeep." Suddenly, she broke down, crying into my chest. I held her close as her tears soaked my shirt. How did I manage to lose him twice? My heart broke all over again. "It's okay. It's okay. We can always get a new one." "No, I can't." I looked into her eyes, worry clearly showing on my face. "Sarah, can we talk for a second? Honestly, no hard feelings." She gave a slow nod. "It's just a doll. You can get another one." I thought I'd said the right thing, but instead, she pulled herself away from me and stormed upstairs. "You don't understand. You never did." "You know what? No, that's not fair. None of this is fair." Before I could get another word in, she was already in our bedroom, slamming the door behind her. I buried my face in my hands, taking slow, deep breaths. People always say grief brings people closer together, but it felt like it was doing the opposite, tearing apart my marriage, myself, and my understanding of what's real and what's not. The next day at work was a blur. I could barely focus. My boss even called me out for my lack of effort. When I got home, Sarah was sitting there, clearly upset. She was still angry with me, but I wasn't sure if I should ask if she was okay. "Hey, hun, are you all right?" I threw him out. "Oh, I'm really sorry. Are you?" "Sarah, surprised you didn't say, 'Thank God.' Look, I'm sorry about this morning. I'm trying, and I know you know that. But it's hard when you keep losing it like that. Do you want to see someone? A grief counselor?" He was my grief counselor. "That's why I'm getting another one, just like you said." Right. Whatever works for you." I managed a weak smile. She sipped her coffee, staring off like she was seeing something that wasn't there. It was clear she was hanging by a thread, but I knew better than to push any further, for both her sake and mine. She let me sleep in our bed that night, but we didn't exchange more than a good night. I felt the back of her ankles against my legs at one point. She even turned towards me in her sleep, but didn't touch me. She just needed space, and I respected that. Not having the doll in the house gave me the best sleep I'd had since everything happened. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in a while, but I quickly noticed the emptiness next to me. She must have gotten up early. As I left the bedroom, I heard humming from behind the nursery door. My confusion grew as I saw Sarah holding the doll in her arms. "Good morning." "I thought you had to get rid of him?" "Good morning." "I did, This is the new one, she smiled. Wow, already? That was fast. Express shipping, she shrugged, chuckling a little. Sweet. I'm going to try and put him down for his nap. Could you make me a cup of coffee? Yeah, sure, I smiled before closing the door behind me. As soon as she couldn't see me anymore, I stood there, completely baffled. Something about it didn't sit right with me. How could she have gotten a new one that quickly? It didn't add up. She'd been so attached to the first one. The thing that stung most was that she was lying to me. After making the coffee, I set the mugs down at the table and checked my phone while I waited for her to come down. He didn't put up a fight. Thank God, she sighed with relief, walking downstairs. That's good, I said, sipping my coffee but keeping my eyes on the screen. She sat across from me, taking slow sips of her coffee, her gaze distant again. I kept glancing up at her, watching her tap her finger on the mug and bite her cheek. Are you all right? She laughed softly, circling her finger around the rim of the mug. The weather's nice today, she said. It is. Maybe you should spend some time outside. You could take him for a walk. Yeah, that sounds nice. Her voice trailed off, like she was in a daze. I helped her take out the baby carriage that we never used and watched with discomfort as she laid the doll in it. Hope you two have a good time, I smiled. We'll be back soon. We kissed quickly before she left. Finally, I could breathe. It wasn't much time, but it was enough. It was also time to think. Over the past few nights, I'd been dealing with things beyond what I thought grief would be like. I knew it would hurt, but not like this. I never really believed in the supernatural. I'd always considered myself a skeptic, but with the constant crying, the footprints, I couldn't explain it. My mind was running in circles, trying to make sense of it, and Sarah seemed to know more than she was letting on, but I was afraid that one more question would drive her away. I couldn't lose her too. Our grief wasn't just going down separate paths anymore. It was heading in completely opposite directions. She needed the doll to heal, and I needed it gone. But I didn't know how to get rid of it without hurting her in the process. I thought about throwing it away and making her think she misplaced it, but that felt cruel. She didn't need more distress. By the time she came back, I hadn't made any progress. I still didn't understand anything, still didn't figure it out. I was just left with more pain. Are you feeling better? Yeah, it was nice to get some sun. This little guy enjoyed it too. Didn't you, buddy? She said, gushing. I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable watching her treat the doll like it was our son. But I knew this was her way of coping, and I had to respect that. To make myself feel better, I kept telling myself that I was just under a lot of stress, and my grieving mind was playing tricks on me. I figured being tormented by him was better than never seeing him at all. That night, she curled up close to me. Our legs tangled as she fell asleep with her arm across my chest. I missed her warmth so much. I had thought that his death had cooled her touch, but she was still so warm, so comforting. It was easy to fall asleep that night with her there, like a child with their favorite stuffed animal. But I was foolish to forget that life isn't just unfair. It's cruel. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by cries from the baby monitor again. But this time, when I opened my eyes, I realized I couldn't move. My heart raced as panic set in, my breaths shallow. My jaw trembled as I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come. A tear rolled down my cheek as I waited for my wife to wake up, but she didn't. I was stuck there, unable to do anything but listen to the cries. I wanted to scream, cry, punch a wall, but I couldn't. Suddenly, the sound cut out, replaced by a static screech. The room went silent, but I stayed frozen, unable to even groan. Then, I heard a door creak open from the hallway, and the crying started again. This time, it wasn't from the speaker. It was coming from the hallway. The cries sounded different, distorted. They were deeper, more drawn out, and they sent chills through my body. I squeezed my eyes shut, begging for the ability to move as the crying grew louder. Then, the bedroom door creaked open, and the cries filled the room. I looked at my wife, who was still asleep. I wondered if this was happening only in my head. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it moving closer. The cries grew deeper with every step, sounding like they were choking on their own breath. When it reached my ear, the sobs were overwhelming. I couldn't move, couldn't hear anything but that suffocating, dizzying crying that made me feel like I was drowning. "Dada," it whispered. In an instant, my body unlocked, and I screamed as though my chest would burst. I scrambled out of bed and threw myself into the corner of the room. "Oh my God!" my wife shouted as she woke up, pulling off her sleep mask and flicking on the lamp. I let out frantic cries, curling up in the corner, my body shaking uncontrollably. "My God, what happened?" I could barely choke out a word through the sobs. "Oh my God." She quickly got out of bed and kneeled next to me. I flinched as she reached for me. "What happened?" I slowly turned to her, my eyes wide in shock. Instead of answering, I stumbled to my feet and rushed out of the bedroom. "Where are you going? What happened?" "Nathan." I ignored her calls as I threw open the nursery door. My eyes scanned the room, and then I saw it, still in the crib. "Nathan, what are you doing? I can't do this anymore." "Nathan, can we talk about this?" She gasped in shock as I pulled the doll from the crib. "You're right, Sarah. This isn't a doll. This is something else, and I can't keep it." "Nathan, please. That's our son." "No, it's not," I shouted. She winced as my words hit her. "Stop, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face as I shook the doll in front of her. "This isn't our son." Then, in a final burst of frustration, I dropped the doll, my hands trembling. In that moment, I realized something unsettling about the strange figure in the crib. Caskets aren't supposed to be that small, and reborn dolls aren't supposed to have internal organs. My wife collapsed to her knees, letting out a gut-wrenching sob, the sound that I could never forget. My heartbeat seemed to stop as I stared at the spilled, grayish tissue and broken parts she tried to cradle in her trembling hands. Slowly, I looked up at her, horror etched on my face. "Sarah, what is this? He didn't belong down there. He belongs with me. With us."